自從19年頭，小弟踏上黑記之路，
魏晉仔執石仔，魏晉
耐唔耐都俾啲強力人士搭膊頭要求傾下偈嘅。
你都知道，可能有啲可能性媒體或者其他資料創作性有機會可能煽惑到一啲仇恨或者假資訊。OK 㗎啦，
驚你俾人利用啫，驚你俾人利用啫。
咁有幾次更加 send message 嚟，盡附上小弟全家嘅姓名、地址、身份證 number、電話，乜都齊晒啊！
爆炸頭哥你好啊，有啲嘢想提提你。你身份證係唔係 XXXXX？ 老豆身份證、老母身份證、兩個家姐身份證，你住 XXXXX？ 提提你今日同612唔好周圍亂玩啊，尤其是上山好危險㗎，我驚唔知有咩人會搞鳩你，或者又會打俾你屋企人揾佢哋飲下茶。總之屋企坐定定唔好亂走啊，好危險㗎。
所以小弟咧就將一隻老虎乸同2隻貓寄咗過去英國先，等佢哋過難民生活啊。安頓好佢哋之後，我再翻嚟香港做留下來的人。2024年6月3日，即日買機票翻香港。6月4日一出機場，即刻收到 message 啦。
早晨，歡迎翻來香港，做好準備未？準備好喺湊格過生日，又送埋 XXX 同啲貓去英國，自己諗。
證明當初我踢走佢哋嘅決定係冇錯嘅。之後梗係翻嚟做回流 KOL， 等黨收編啦，享受由治及興帶嚟嘅好處。你哋準備好未？大家好，大家好，今日咧我哋又睇下范斯啦。放心，一定唔會悶親大家嘅。總之我每次即係做呢個搬運工，做搬運工播范斯啲片咧，仲多過我平時啲片，唉，真係情何以堪。其實我本身咧已經一條係整好咗嘅，不過咧我覺得略嫌個內容咧就冇咁新鮮啊，有部分係重複咗啦。嗱，唔係范斯表現差，而係咧嗰個內容咧同上兩次嗰個訪問咧係有好大部分重複咗嘅。咁但係咧，我又想揾一啲又可以突顯到個台㗎、個主持啦，甚至乎范斯3樣嘢都可以突顯到嘅嘢出嚟，即係有質素地呈現俾大家睇啊嘛，而唔係一窩蜂咁樣，一日出10幾條片咁樣刷流量啊、刷 view 數咁樣，唔係咁樣樣啊嘛。我係要質素。咁所以咧，我到最後將嗰條片咧 delete 咗唔出街嘅，反而咧今次我就用咗 NBC 嘅訪問啊。嗱，呢個訪問咧個女主持咧就比上一次個男主持咧即係功架就好好多嘅，同埋咧即係功課就做足啦，同埋咧冇咁 hea 最緊要。咁喺呢度咧都要俾一俾阿 credit 個范斯啊，因為咧即係都知道一定係送羊入虎口啊，咁但係咧佢都係送上去啊，照同佢對戰。咁今次女主持咧係有追問啦，同埋有搶咪嘅情況出現嘅。咁當然搶咪係一個良性嘅互動嚟嘅，其實係咁先至同嗰個受訪者咧有火花、有激情嘅互動啊嘛。最緊要咧係想挑撥到受訪者嘅情緒。咁當然啦嚇，即係呢啲外國大媒體嘅記者一定係識呢樣嘢嘅，而唔係好似香港嗰啲咁，最緊要和平理性非暴力，大家唔好搶咪，問完一個答一個，問完一個答一個，唔好太大聲講嘢，即係唔好激動咁樣，呢啲好 bullshit 嘅其實。咁今次女主持咧就做到我心目中嗰種合格嘅級數啦，即係你唔好理佢個政治取態先啦，因為咧無論係咩政治取態都好啦 ，suppose 咧你係要企喺受訪者嘅對面嘅。如果民主黨嘅人上嚟做訪問咧，你就要企喺共和黨嗰邊質問佢。咁如果共和黨嘅人上到嚟咧，就應該用民主黨嘅角度去質問佢，咁先至咧係叫做即係做到嘢啊。咁喺而家左膠嘅媒體底下咧，即係范斯上去就一定係冇懸念，所有嘅台啊大台咧都係站喺民主黨嘅立場去質問佢噶啦，爭在個功架夠唔夠嘅啫。嗱，今次嗰個女主持咧，技巧上係有，不過咧佢就略嫌有啲真係太過阻岩啦，因為咧係好多地方咧都係嘗試用呢啲偷換概念啊，甚至乎係一啲語言陷阱咧去陰范斯嘅。咁但係范斯咧都係一招架，兼且咧係冇中計嘅。咁例如第一個問題咧就係講 Donald Trump 如果做到總統之後咧就會加外國嘅關稅啦。嗱，咁佢冇講係咩外國嘅產品啦，咁但係大家都知其實係一啲中國嘅產品嘅關稅啦。咁 NBC 個女主持咧嗰個觀點咧就係，喂，如果你加咗關稅，咁嗰件 product 咁啊即係貴咗咯，貴咗嗰個成本就會轉嫁咗喺市民身上，咁你真係要令到啲市民係買貴嘢咯。喂，咁唔好喎。咁范斯咧就兜翻轉頭，如果唔加呢啲關稅的話咧，呢啲產品咧喺美國本土度傾銷的話咧，就會影響到美國本土嘅行業同埋咧工人嘅就業機會啦。咁變相咧係得不償失嘅。咁女主持咧就不停咁樣追問都係追住一個 point， 就係話喂，俾貴咗。咁但係咧係見到啲短期嘅利益，係見唔到啲長期嘅利益啦。咁范斯就不停咁樣出招去反駁佢啦，就話加咗關稅保護到本土經濟同埋工人之後咧，其實佢好多生活成本都會降翻低嘅。 反而咧令到本地人嘅收入咧就會增加，就業率增加啊，甚至乎咧其他嘅生活成本咧都會減少翻嘅。咁呢個咧就係女主持第一個偷換概念嘅地方啦。你諗下咁耐以嚟打貿易戰，點解要加關稅咧？就係因為咧用補貼嚟傾銷啊嘛，即係咧中國嘅補貼電動車咁樣去傾銷，打爛晒外國嗰啲汽車生產商同埋工人嘅飯碗啊！咁所以咧先至整個關稅出嚟加翻嚟啫嘛。你唔可以一味用政府嘅補貼咧，將啲貨物廉價咁傾銷喺美國嗰度，然之後就打亂嗰個市場噶嘛。咁但係 NBC 個主持咧係完全忽略咗呢一個嘅誘因嘅。咁第二個原因我會用呢個訪問而唔係用我 delete 咗一條嘅訪問咧，就係一個好大原因就係今次係有提及過小甘迺迪轉態嘅。咁個女主持咧就話：喂，甘迺迪其實講咗某啲嘢，其實你係咪同意佢講嗰啲嘢？即係我唔穿橋啦嚇。咁范斯就話：我梗係唔會全部100% 同意啦。咁大家有大家唔同嘅意見，唔同意係好正常噶嘛。咁因為小甘迺迪咧個立場上咧係反對疫苗嘅。咁個女主持當然引用嗰啲所謂專家嘅證據啦，就話：喂，打疫苗同埋戴口罩其實係對小朋友對我哋所有人都好㗎。咁你而家係咪覺得疫苗係冇用先？咁疫苗真係有用㗎嘛？咁咪可以救翻好多人啦。咁其實佢一刀切范斯同佢講：你唔應該咧就話一係咧就啱，一係就錯晒。要係咧係即係譬如話小朋友嘅發展戴咗口罩之後咧，其實對於佢哋嘅facial expression 咧係有影響嘅，令到佢哋社交係有障礙嘅。咁所以咧其實唔應該話一刀切唔戴口罩或者一刀切戴口罩，而係咧兩者取得個平衡。咁但係呢個女主持咧就好想逼佢咧剔晒，即係咧一係就極端地戴口罩或者極端地打疫苗，一係咧就極端地唔打疫苗，極端地唔戴口罩咁樣啦。咁但係咧即係范斯都冇落呢個陷阱嗰度嘅。雖然成個過程咧女主持係追問啦，同埋咧一啲push pull 嘅技巧咧其實係有嘅，不過咧佢個內容咧就即係渣少少咯，我覺得就佢技巧係有，但係咧拿捏唔到個內容啊。冇內容之下咧，就只可以用啲偷換概念嘅方式咧去質問個范斯。咁仲有一個好長嘅部分咧，就係講緊喂，究竟咧非法移民你點樣處理啊？咁個女主持個態度咧就係覺得，喂，你而家禁非法移民係咪即係拆散人哋嘅家庭啊？因為咧好多非法移民咧都係打住同家人團聚嗰個旗號噶嘛。咁你而家要遣返人哋要驅逐人哋啊，咁咪即係拆散人哋嘅家庭咯。佢係偷換咗個概念啊，佢用嗰個道德高地咧嚟講，喂，呢個人哋非法入境美國係有高尚嘅道德情操，就係咧同家人團聚。如果你唔俾佢哋啲人係非法進入美國做 II 的話，咁咪即係拆散人哋家庭咯。你點可能拆散人哋家庭㗎？咁范斯咧其實如果係答係我會拆散人哋家庭，或者係唔會我唔會拆散人哋家庭咧，呢兩個答案咧都唔得嘅。咁但係范斯咧就真係咧成程咧就同佢咧不停咁樣喺度即係 push pull 啦，唔會正面回答嘅。但係咧亦都唔會話完全講咗第二啲嘢即係唔穿橋。大家可以睇下嗰位咧其實幾精彩嘅。因為如果話我拆散人哋家庭咧，咁即係道德高地上面已經輸咗咯。咁因為大家都知道，如果你係阻止一啲 II 入境美國的話咧，如果佢哋有啲遠房親戚喺美國的話咧，咁即係等同係拆散佢哋嘅屋企咯，即係冇分別嘅啫嘛。咁但係佢就唔想喺道德上面咧輸咗俾嗰個即係女主持咧，佢好明咧其實想挑骨頭喺啲咧議題上邊咧，政策肯定講你唔贏噶啦。咁但係咧我哋專登揾啲偷換概念嘅道德高地嚟佔據先，佔據然之後咧喺道德高地上邊咧開炮射你II 咧係啱噶，點解？因為佢哋要家庭團聚，所以咧我哋一定去俾II入嚟，唔可以驅逐佢哋噶。咁如果范斯咧就話唔係我驅逐佢都好啦，唔會令佢哋拆散家庭啊。咁冇可能嘅，因為只要有一個人咧話佢哋如果有屋企人喺美國嗰度，咁你咪即係拆散人哋家庭咯。即係所以咧呢個問題咧係唔可以答嘅，係都係一個陷阱嚟，因為咧佢呢個係邏輯陷阱嚟嘅，答咩你都係死。因為女主持咧其實唔係用一個政策嘅對與否去問佢，而係咧用緊一個道德高地嘅背景去問佢。咁所以咧范斯都好用力咁樣同佢搶咪即係對答咁樣，即係互相有一個攻防啦。咁另外就係一個墮胎問題咧，墮胎問題咧范斯咧即係都答得幾好噶，我覺得。即係咧共和黨嘅態度咧唔係就話一刀切所有州就俾墮胎或者所有州唔俾墮胎，因為咧其實係冇一個定案嚟嘅墮唔墮胎。咁佢咧就係話應該自己州政府咧自己搞翻按照當地嘅情況自己搞翻咁啊最好嘅。大家唔好咧就 cap 一個Donald Trump 講嘅説話，然之後冇將佢後邊嗰句説話鋪埋出嚟，咁當咗係 Donald Trump 講嘅。咁你呢啲咧就係斷章取義啦。咁其實佢做得幾好嘅。咁到有一 part 咧就係女記者咧想停一停范斯喂。得啦，我哋冇時間再討論啦，我哋講下一個話題啦。咁但係范斯得，我有時間，我唔怕，我俾你，我留耐啲咁樣啦。跟住范斯就不停咁喺度講，跟住咧個女主持咧都放棄啦，算夠數啦，等你自己講啦。 其實幾好睇嘅今次。阻住晒。咁啊，最後咧就梗係要睇一睇網民嘅留言啦。嗱，NBC 咧都係世界知名嘅傳媒嚟嘅，不過咧就如果係最 top 入邊嘅三角形尖頂入邊咧，佢應該係第二線啦。咁所以咧，你見條片咧其實都唔係好多人睇嘅，44萬。咁但係咧留言方面咧就精彩好多啦。第一個留言咧就係話：喂，我哋希望阿 Camera 啦，即係咧賀錦麗啦都會進行一啲咁 tough 嘅 interview 啊。有3000，哇！榴蓮你做咩啊？即係咧，佢暗示咗，喂，賀錦麗點解唔進行一啲咁 tough 嘅 interview 或者係一啲冇咁扯或者咁有攻擊性嘅 interview 去訪問佢咧？咁佢下邊啲留言咧都幾精彩嘅，300幾個留言覆翻佢咧。咁佢一個回覆咧就好搞笑啊！即係，好唔好彩啊？佢淨係會對到一啲咧係有 bias 嘅問題。即係如果係有呢啲訪問的話咧，嗰個訪問嗰個立場咧係會偏向係會利好民主黨或者係賀錦麗嘅。咁另外一個留言咧就話：喂，呢個唔係一個訪問嚟喎，呢個係一個 interrogation 啊，即係審問嚟㗎。咁我都覺得係一個審問嚟。咁但係咧，即係如果啱啱開頭所講咧，其實呢啲 interview 咧先至係有嘢睇嘅。即係你冇可能話好平和咁樣，問一條問題，你答一條問題，跟住就唔追問啦。好啊，我接受咁樣樣，接受你個問題啊，我接受你個答案，跟住下一條問題，即係呢啲唔好睇，亦都係即係追唔到啲核心嘅嘢，追唔到啲火花，追唔到一啲chemical reaction 出嚟。咁反而咧呢一種嘅 interrogation 咧先至好睇嘅。其實咁另一個係好多人讚嘅咧，就係無論你係中唔中意范斯都好咧 ，at least 咧佢係respect 呢個嘅選民，同埋咧夠膽咧去做一個 unscripted interview 咧，即係冇一個對稿嘅訪問啊。同埋最緊要咧就係 hostile press， 即係咧係一個敵對立場嘅傳媒，即係大家都知其實即係咧其實大家都知傳媒係企晒喺民主黨嗰邊噶啦。咁但係入邊嘅回覆咧都會話翻：喂，其實范斯都講緊大話嘅啫嘛，Donald Trump都講緊大話，全部都講緊大話嘅。咁其實咧即係呢個嘅所謂大話咧，其實好美國嘅。點解咧？就好似上一條片咁樣樣。所以條片咧啲回覆咧都會話有個人就話佢哋全部滿口大話，跟住咧下邊嗰啲撐 Donald Trump 或者撐范斯嗰啲咧就話請舉出一個例子，佢係講緊大話，跟住咧大家喺度笑啊，大家好開心咁樣就係講，即係點解咧就話喂，呢個現象嚟嘅，呢個美國人嘅現象就係咧不停咁樣話 Donald Trump 同埋范斯講大話，咁但係咧係講唔出佢哋係講過啲乜嘢大話，咁即係又係講得又係喺度即係鬧交啦，即係成日即係你哋有興趣自己睇就係咧。喂，究竟佢講緊啲咩大話先？唔該你舉出啲例子啊！或者佢嗰個訪問入邊，佢有啲乜嘢講緊大話嘅？咁你講翻啦。咁即係好多呢啲嘅衝突咧，係發生講喺美國入邊嘅。咁仲有一個咧就係喂賀錦麗咧，就永遠都唔會答應咧去做呢啲嘅訪問嘅，因為咧即係好有攻擊性啦，同埋咧好尖鋭。你幻想下賀錦麗咧接受呢啲傳媒訪問咧係會點啊？賀錦麗，我想請問一下，如果小金艾迪依家轉咗態唔撐你，你有咩回覆啊？對於邊境問題喺你哋任內咧，真係發生好多好嚴重啊！好多人偷渡入境，你哋都堵截唔到啊！有咩解決方法啊？未來如果我上咗任咧，做咗總統咧，我就會點咁。但係咧，即係諗翻轉頭，喂，你而家係副總統嚟㗎，咁點解你而家唔做先？要係做咗總統你先做嘅？你而家副總統有權有名㗎喎，你同老細講一講你同嗰個總統講一講點樣做，大家商討㗎。咁其實咪做咗咯？你使乜等下一屆？即係依家咧，賀錦麗咧最俾人詬病咧就係成日話：喂，我如果到咗總統之後，我就會點。咁點解你依家係做唔到咧？係咪先？咁仲有一個留言咧就話：喂，如果你問賀錦麗呢啲即係 one of these question 咧，即係是哪一條問題啦？上邊嘅是哪一條問題？佢咧就好似Joe Biden 嗰個凳咁樣接埋咁跟住喺下邊有個留言就好搞笑，就好似咧佢個 staircase 咁，即係好鬼有趣嘅啲美國佬。咁呢個人咧就問一問民主黨人啦，喂，咁多年嚟賀錦麗究竟咧點解唔去接受呢啲嘅訪問啊？咁樣係對美國人咧好唔尊重嘅咁樣啦。咁呢個人咧就話呢個訪問咧係令人嘔心地極不誠實嘅。咁呢個就係女記者咧。咁對於個女主持咧就係 shame on you。咁呢個女記者咧其實幾慢料嘅，係哈佛畢業嘅。 基本上出道到而家咧都係做 NBC， 一步一步做上去做白宮記者啦，然之後咧再做呢個節目嘅。咁你見佢膚色咧都知，其實佢父母咧係一黑一白嘅。咁不過咧今次成個訪問入邊咧又冇，即係冇見過佢係提及一啲膚色嘅問題啦，即係特別有賀錦麗嘅膚色問題。咁但係我覺得好嘅，因為咧如果係再問的話咧，其實同上一次個訪問咧就會重複咗噶啦。咁所以咧都係一個好嘅取捨嚟嘅。咁不過咧整體而言咧，呢個女記者其實冇上一次個男記者咧咁慢料嘅。不過咧上一次個男記者咧又真係即係太過入啦，個表現真係唔好意思。呢個女記者咧反而係即係知道一個好嘅訪問點樣去辣興個受訪者啊嘛。即係縱使佢有技巧，但係冇內容都好啦，即係起碼佢知道點樣做，係做得唔好啫。好啦，唔講咁耐，咁依家去片都係嗰句啦。英文字幕咧都應該係90%啱嘅，中文字幕咧甚至乎係比上一次咧好咗啲添喎。我翻 tune 咗少少。咁大哥都係嗰句咧，係一定係會有翻譯嘅錯誤嘅，大家唔好誤會，以為100% 啱。好，去片。
Senator J.D. Vance, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for having us here in Cincinnati. Let's start off with the Democratic National Convention.
Sure.
Some of what we heard this past week. Vice President Kamala Harris, in making her case, said that the tariff plans that Donald Trump is proposing will hurt the middle class. Here's what she said specifically, quote,
Sure.
He intends to enact what in effect is a national sales tax, call it a Trump tax, that would raise prices on middle-class families by almost $4,000 a year. Now, the estimates vary, but how do you respond to that charge that Trump's tariffs would hurt the middle class?
Yeah, so if you step back a little bit, Kristen, there's this whole thing that Kamala Harris did at the convention where she made a bunch of claims about what would happen and not enough actually reflection on what already happened, right? Because Donald Trump was already president. He used tariffs to bring manufacturing jobs back to our country, and I think he'll do it again. And he did it while keeping prices extremely low. Because if you go back to the Trump presidency, we had 12,000 factories that were built during Donald Trump's presidency. Inflation never really ticked above 2% his entire administration. In fact, was sort of around 1.5% most of the time that he was president. So when Kamala Harris says, if we do the thing that Trump already did, it's going to be way worse than it was last time, I just don't think that makes a lot of sense.
Well, let's talk about
Sure.
Trump's record during his first term. He did impose rounds of tariffs, and it cost Americans nearly $80 billion in new taxes. Do you acknowledge that imposing more tariffs will ultimately cost consumers?
Well, what it really does is it penalizes importers from bringing goods outside the country into the country. And I think that's just a necessary thing. We know that China and a number of other countries are using effectively slave labor to undercut the wages of American workers. Donald Trump thinks that has to stop. And again, what Kamala Harris is saying, Kristen, is that if you do this, you're somehow going to cause skyrocketing inflation. In reality, Donald Trump already did it. He brought a lot of jobs back, and it didn't cause inflation.
But it caused consumers to pay more. They paid more in taxes, $80 billion worth. Do you acknowledge that consumers ultimately will pay more if there are more tariffs imposed?
So economists...
Do you just acknowledge that?
No, I don't, Kristen, because I think economists really disagree about the effects of tariffs because there can be a dynamic effect, right? So what some economists will say is what you just said, that it will actually raise costs for consumers. But what other people say, and I think the record supports what this other view, is that it causes this dynamic effect where more jobs come into the country. Anything that you lose on the tariff from the perspective of the consumer, you gain in higher wages. So you're ultimately much better off. You have more take-home pay, you have better jobs, and also we have more reliance. Because one of the things we learned during COVID, and I don't, by the way, blame Democrats for this, but one of the things we learned during COVID, Kristen, is that if our supply chains are really brittle, if we depend on the Chinese to make too much of our stuff, then prices can skyrocket at a time of crisis. The economists who say that tariffs are bad, they don't take that into account. And we've all learned it the hard way.
And it is economists across the board, really. I mean, the Wall Street Journal says economic data showed that Donald Trump's trade war with China did not achieve its objectives of reversing the declines in U.S. manufacturing or reshoring factory jobs. I hear what you're saying. It's a complicated picture, but just on that bottom line point, you can't guarantee that Americans won't wind up paying a penny more, can you?
Well, I think that what you can guarantee is that if you don't bring more manufacturing jobs back into this country, you don't make our supply chains more stable, you're going to cause higher prices over the long term. I think that is what is absolutely true.
But you acknowledge they could wind up paying more?
What I acknowledge, Kristen, is that unless we bring more manufacturing jobs back to this country, we are going to end up paying more in the long term. Remember, the whole promise, now, again, this was a bipartisan thing. My own party was as wrong about it as Democrats were, and Donald Trump was right about it. What they said is that if you shipped all of our manufacturing to East Asia and to Mexico, Americans would pay lower prices. Well, here we are now, and Americans are paying higher prices. And just one more thing on this, Kristen, because it's really important to go at what Kamala Harris actually said in her convention speech. She says that she wants to stand up to China on behalf of American workers. If you're not willing to impose tariffs on companies that are manufacturing in China, using slave labor in China, you're not standing up to the Chinese, and Americans are really going to suffer.
And on pricing and prices right now, inflation obviously at its lowest level since 2021. But let's move on. Robert F. Kennedy, the big news yesterday.
Very big news.
He suspended his campaign, announced he's endorsing Donald Trump. He is also known as someone who has blamed vaccines for autism, antidepressants for school shootings, and recently said, quote, he won't take sides on what happened on 9/11. Do you have any hesitation about accepting his endorsement?
No, Kristen, I don't, because we're going to disagree on issues, right? There are things that Robert Kennedy has said that I disagree with. I'm sure there are things that he said, or that I've said, excuse me, that he's going to disagree with. But I think what his endorsement represents is that Donald J. Trump's Republican Party is a big tent party. I was raised by two grandparents who are sort of classic blue dog Democrats. They believed in having a border. They believed that you shouldn't have censorship in the United States of America. They believed in common sense economic policies. They may have disagreed with Donald Trump about tax policy, but they believed in some fundamental American values. And I think what RFK's endorsement really shows is that the Kennedy Democrats are actually more at home in the Republican Party of Donald Trump. And unfortunately, Kamala Harris's party, higher prices, doing nothing to fight back against the Chinese, to say nothing of a wide open border. That is not JFK's Democratic Party. It's not RFK's Democratic Party. We're thrilled to have the Kennedy Democrats where they belong.
Well, and some in the Kennedy family have stepped forward to say that they sharply disagree with this endorsement. But let's just go back very quickly. He says he isn't taking sides on 9/11. Do you agree with that statement?
Well, of course I don't agree with that, Kristen. Now, to be clear, I don't know what RFK actually said there. Maybe there was additional context. Of course, you actually have to see what people say before you agree or disagree with it. I certainly have taken sides in 9/11. I'm the pro-America side. I don't think that we should have been attacked, and I certainly think hitting back against the terrorists was justified. I don't know what RFK said there, but what I do know is that RFK said a lot of very interesting and important things, that the Democratic Party has become too pro-censorship, that the Democratic Party, especially in the wake of COVID, became really anti-freedom and anti-child. I mean, you have Democrats saying that we should be masking toddlers in their schools, even though we knew it caused developmental disabilities. I agree with RFK that that was crazy.
Well, to be fair, there was a lot of information that scientists were grappling with as it came in, and masks were perceived to stop the spread of the disease. Let's move on.
Totally fair.
Yeah.
But the one thing before we move on that I would say on that is there were important leaders. Donald Trump was among them, RFK was among them, who were saying some of this stuff is crazy, and if we had listened to them, I think our kids would have been much better off in the wake of the pandemic.
I mean, scientists did show that masks help to stop the spread of the disease. Let's talk about another big issue.
Disabilities for toddlers, right? We have to be able to balance this stuff, and I think the way that RFK struck that balance was much smarter, unfortunately, than the way that Kamala Harris did.
Let's talk about another big issue. It was talked about at the Democratic National Convention. It's being talked about on the campaign trail. Abortion.
Sure.
Democrats made the case this week and beyond this week that Donald Trump, if elected, will impose a federal ban on abortion if he wins. Now, Donald Trump says he won't. But can you commit, Senator, sitting right here with me today, that if you and Donald Trump are elected, that you will not impose a federal ban on abortion?
I can absolutely commit that, Kristen, and Donald Trump has been as clear about that as possible. I think it's important to step back and say, what has Donald Trump actually said on the abortion question, and how is it different from what Kamala Harris and the Democrats have said? Donald Trump wants to end this culture war over this particular topic. If California wants to have a different abortion policy from Ohio, then Ohio has to respect California and California has to respect Ohio. Donald Trump's view is that we want the individual states and their individual cultures and their unique political sensibilities to make these decisions because we don't want to have a nonstop federal conflict over this issue, the federal government ought to be focused on getting food prices down, getting housing prices down, issues, of course, where Kamala Harris has been a total disaster. So I think Donald Trump is right. We want the federal government to focus on these big economic and immigration questions. Let the states figure out their own abortion policy.
Let me just follow up with you a little bit on that point, because I've been talking to Republicans, including Senator Lindsey Graham just last week, who've made it very clear that if Donald Trump is elected, if you are elected, they will continue to press this point. Senator Graham said to me, I'm going to keep saying that there should be a federal ban. If such a piece of legislation landed on Donald Trump's desk, would he veto it?
Well, I think it'd be very clear he would not support it. I mean, he said that explicitly. Yeah, I mean, if you're not supporting it as the President of the United States, you fundamentally have to veto it.
So he would veto a federal abortion ban?
I think he would. He said that explicitly that he would. And
I don't
again,
think he's ever said explicitly he would. He said that to you?
Lindsey Graham, Kristen, I would be surprised. I mean, again, I need to see the context on what Lindsey Graham said, because Lindsey Graham himself has not advocated a federal abortion ban. Lindsey Graham has advocated a federal minimum standard. Now, to be clear, that is not Donald Trump's view. Donald Trump disagrees with Lindsey Graham on this, but no Republican, at least no Republican with any reasonable power, is saying that we should have a complete national abortion ban. I haven't heard that from any of my colleagues. And to be clear, Donald Trump, I think, has staked his position and made it very explicit. He wants this to be a state decision. States are going to make this determination themselves.
All right, let's talk about women voters more broadly. The Census Bureau estimates there are 22 million women between the ages of 20 and 40 who, for whatever reason, do not have children. What do you say to those women who hear some of your comments, including the childless cat lady comments, which you've been asked about, but who feel as though you won't represent them?
Well, I'd say, first of all, I will represent you. I want to be the vice president for the whole country, and I want to represent everybody. And yes, I made a sarcastic comment years ago that I think that a lot of Democrats have willfully misinterpreted. But what I've simply said is that I think that it's really a profound change that's happened in our country, where we become anti-family, and I would like to change that. And I think if you talk to young women, whether they have children or don't want to have children, what you consistently hear is that a lot of young women feel like they don't have options. I saw this with my own wife, who's a working mother, who's a very, very accomplished litigator. She has 3 beautiful kids and always felt like she was having to balance being a good mom with being the kind of litigator that she wanted to be. I just want women to have more choices. I've seen that very personally in my own family, and I think it's something that is broken about our country.
Let me zoom out a little bit then.
Please.
You're calling it a sarcastic comment.
Sure.
And yet, some women, and you got the feedback in real time, felt like it was a gut punch to them personally. Do you regret making that comment?
Look, I regret certainly that a lot of people took it the wrong way, and I certainly regret that the DNC and Kamala Harris lied about it.
But do you regret what you said, Senator?
Look, Kristen, I'm going to say things from time to time that people disagree with. I'm a real person. I'm going to make jokes. I'm going to say things sarcastically, and I think that what's important is that we focus on the policy. There are certainly going to be things that I say. If I'm elected vice president, people are going to say, well, I wish he had said that differently. I think it's most important to actually be the person I actually am, and to say those sarcastic comments were made in the service of a real substantive point. This country has become too anti-family. It's too expensive to afford a house. It's too expensive to afford groceries. Donald Trump and I want to change that, and unless we get better leadership, we're not going to.
But again, just very quickly, given that people have told you directly, have spoken out, have said that they were offended, they were hurt by those comments, do you wish you never made those childless cat lady comments?
I think that it's much more important for me to just be a normal human being who sometimes says things that people disagree with. I have a lot of regrets, Kristen, but making a joke 3 years ago is not in the top 10 of the list.
All right, another big topic in this race is immigration. There has been a lot of discussion about Donald Trump's plans for mass deportation.
Yeah.
According to one estimate, more than 11 million U.S. citizens live in households with mixed immigration status, including more than 5 million children. If you and former President Trump were elected, would you separate families as a part of your mass deportation effort?
Well, we have to start with the foundational issue here, which is we have 25 million illegal aliens in this country right now because Kamala Harris has refused to do her job.
Very quickly, DHS says it's much lower. It's closer to 8 million. I don't know. Where do you get the 25 million from?
Well, I think the 25 million are the people that should have been deported that maybe weren't deported, plus you had another 12 to 15 million that have come in since Kamala Harris. Look,
DHS
whatever the number is,
that number for the record. They say it's closer to 8 to 10 million.
But I think there are reasons to think that DHS is underestimating. Whatever the real number is, it's way too high, right? It's millions upon millions of illegal immigrants that have come in just since Kamala Harris became the border czar a few years ago.
She was put in charge of the root causes of migration.
Well, the root causes of migration, I would say, Kristen, is that Kamala Harris refuses to do her job as borders are. And let's just start there. I want to answer your question, but I think it's important to sort of sequence this in the right way. So if you want to get control of the illegal immigration problem, you have to stop the bleeding. You have to stop so many people from coming here illegally in the first place. And that means undoing everything that Kamala Harris did practically on day one of the administration. You have to reimpose deportations. You have to stop catch and release. Stop granting asylum to every single person who comes in here and says that they need asylum, and stop granting mass parole. These policies are why we have the immigration crisis that we have. So I think focus on fixing the problem. Before we even fix the problem, we've got to stop the problem from getting worse.
And as you know, President Biden passed a series of executive actions, and illegal border crossings are now at their lowest levels in about 5 years, so much so that Greg Abbott is no longer busing people to other cities. But let me ask you this fundamental question,
please.
Fundamental question. Will families be separated under your mass deportation?
And again, because you made a point here, I do want to answer this question about families and about deportations, but you made this point that border crossings are lower. Border crossings at the southern border are lower because the Harris administration is sending more immigrants through the ports of entry. So instead of coming through the southern border, they're now being flown at taxpayer expense to the ports of entry all over our country. The number of illegal crossings, Chris, and this is a really important point, they're not any lower. They're just shuffling how the people are coming into the country in the first place. And this is very important.
They're
now,
able to
about
process them more
deportations.
efficiently, but Greg Abbott's not setting them to other
Kristen,
states.
I don't want a border czar who makes it more efficient for illegal immigrants to come into this country. That's why we have the problem that we have.
Senator, to this question, because so many people want to know the answer to this, will families be separated under your mass deportation policy?
I think that families are currently being separated, and you're certainly going to have to deport some people in this country. Now, I think you start
that's a yes?
I think you start with the most violent criminals in our country. Those people need to be deported. That's where you focus federal resources. I think you, of course, have a number of children who are currently living with drug cartel members, not actually their families. We need to, of course, find their families and get them back to their families. But it's very interesting here, because what Kamala Harris says is that Donald Trump wants to separate families. Kamala Harris's policies have led to thousands upon thousands of migrant children living with sex traffickers and drug cartels.
Well,
that is the consequence of her policies.
But there's not a policy to separate families. There's not a policy to separate families.
Oh, if you know that your policies will lead to family separation, you don't get to claim. Kristen, this is important. Kamala Harris cannot claim that she doesn't know that her policies are leading to family separation. They are, and everybody knows it, and she has to take responsibility for that. That's what real leadership is.
There are some families who have been separated, as you say, some because their parents are criminals. But of course, under the Trump administration, there was a zero tolerance policy, which is an actual policy. But let's move on.
No, please,
because we're running out of time.
Can I just make this point, Kristen, because this is so important.
We are running out of time.
There was a zero, I'll give you more time. There was a zero tolerance policy during the Trump administration, and that led to less family separation than under Kamala Harris's border policies. That's what's so striking about this. Actually enforcing our border is the most humane thing for children and certainly for American citizens.
But I don't hear you denying that families will be separated. Let's move on to something that Donald Trump said in North Carolina and yet again Friday night. He said, quote, "Our primary focus is not to get out the vote. It's to make sure they don't cheat, because we have all the votes you need. You can see it." Why is Donald Trump casting doubt on the election before it's even happened?
I don't think that's what Donald Trump is doing.
Well, that's what he's doing. That's what he says here. We need to make sure they don't cheat.
I think that what he's saying is that we want to pursue a set of policies in the Republican Party that make it easier for every legal ballot to be cast and counted, but make it harder for illegally cast ballots to be counted. Now, we can disagree about how many of those there are, whether there are a few hundred, a few thousand, maybe more, but just in the last week, okay, so just in the last week, once in Arizona and once in Pennsylvania, there were major court wins that make our ballot process more secure and more effective. I think that's what Donald Trump is talking about, is we have to pursue, sometimes through litigation, sometimes through better policy at the state or national level, a set of rules that make sure every ballot is legally counted.
Well, it's very different from your message, which is you said, and I'll quote you back to yourself, we have to work as hard as possible to persuade Americans to vote for us. Are you on the same page as Donald Trump? Because, again, he seems to be casting doubt
Of course,
on the results of the election before it's even happened.
Of course we're on the same page, Kristen. We talk all the time, and I guarantee you, if you sat here and said, Mr. President, Donald Trump, do you believe that we need to do, that your campaign needs to persuade voters as much as possible? Of course he's going to say yes. That's not inconsistent with thinking that we need to pursue a set of approaches that make sure legal ballots get counted, illegal ballots don't get counted.
Do you have faith the 2024 election will be free and fair?
I do, Kristen. I do think it's going to be free and fair, and we're going to do everything that we can to make sure that happens. We're going to pursue every pathway to make sure, again, legal ballots get counted. But I feel very good about where we are. I think we're going to win this race, and I think we're going to win it in a very good election.
All right. Senator J.D. Vance.
Thanks, Kristen.
Thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Likewise.
Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep.